All right. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Dr. Patrick Lockwood coming back to you live on Facebook here to discuss sex. Always a fun topic, always interesting stuff to say about sex. So I hope whoever joins asks as many questions as possible, and I'll do what I can to answer them. And this should be interesting, I hope. Before I get into the main topic, just want to go through a couple of updates. So things are going well with the book. The book is almost finished. We have gone through the first of two proofreads of the final, what it's going to look like in full format, like it's ready to print, basically. We're just double checking every little thing. So that's going to happen relatively soon, based upon how quickly they work. It's going to happen very soon. So thank you again to Mascot Books. We are doing a lot of good work there. So yeah, be on the lookout. Hopefully in the next month or so, I can have something in your hands. The fear problem is on its way out. So why sex? Why talk about sex? It's a very important topic for a variety of reasons because, you know, if you think about it, it's one of the most kind of normal behaviors that we have as humans. Sex is a fundamental part of being alive, being in a relationship with someone. Unfortunately, I think, because of all of these dating and hookup apps, sex has become more of a hobby or a sport, so to speak. And I'll talk about that a little bit later when I talk about kind of the evolutionary psychology of things. But sex is being kind of pushed into a different category than what it was originally designed for, so to speak, by evolution. So I want to talk about that problem a little bit more. Obviously, if we are not being very mindful or thoughtful about what kind of sex we're having, then the spread of disease goes up. And unfortunately, if you look at the CDC's website, HIV is going up in a couple of groups, especially men who have sex with men in a variety of age ranges, especially younger and much older, over 65. Things like herpes, chlamydia, gonorrhea are actually still on the rise, I believe, according to the CDC research. So you can double check me on that. So we need to be slightly more mindful. It seems like we don't want to wear condoms anymore. And that's kind of a problem. Another reason I want to talk about sex is because it is such a huge part of intimate relationships or dating relationships that it's usually a source of great contention, a source of great conflict in relationships. So I want to clarify some things there and some ideas about how to deal with that better, and just clear up the misconceptions about what sex really is. So I'll talk about sex generally, and then I'll talk about the evolutionary psychology perspective as to why we're supposed to be having sex and what it's for. Broadly, this is not going to be very deep because we don't have a lot of time. Then I'll talk about sex and health. And then the last thing I'll do is I always want to give you a little bit of neuroscience. So I'll talk about sex in the brain, and I'll leave you with a slightly political comment about sex. So sex. It's a very interesting behavior. Sexual behavior across most species, in particular, is partially driven by our genetics and our hormone and how our brain is developed in the first, let's say, in the womb up through the first, 6 years of life. And it's partially developed by our environment. So I'm going to say that again real quickly so everyone understands very clearly what I'm saying. Sexual behavior, irrespective of your orientation or your preference for partner, but just sexual behavior in general, which is under the category of sexual orientation, or can be, is partially driven by our genetics and our hormones and how our brain is built in utero and afterwards in the first 6 years of life. And it's partially driven by environment. Now, the degree to which we have an inborn tendency towards sexual behavior of a specific kind, whether it's homosexuality, heterosexuality, bisexuality, pansexuality, doesn't matter. There's no definitive understanding from the research about what percentage is nature and what percentage is nurture. And if you ever find someone who calls himself a doctor or a physician or a researcher who says they know for a fact how much nature and how much nurture goes into things, you should avoid them like the plague. There are so many individual differences. If you read Jaak Panksepp's work and you read other kind of behavioral neuroscientists' work on how people develop in the womb and how the brain is masculinized by estrogen or feminized by testosterone in the womb, it's a very, very complex dance. It's a very, very complex game and set of dynamics and factors. Stress affects it, diet affects it, drug and alcohol affect it. All sorts of things affect that hormone expression in the womb. So to know exactly whether there's some kind of genetic thing or there's some kind of in the womb thing or some kind of environmental thing afterwards is nearly impossible unless you sit there and you just hyper focus on, 1,000 mothers pre-birth, during labor, post-birth for 6 years or 7 years. That would be the only way to figure it out more specifically. So that's sexual behavior in terms of how we come to be the way we are. Interesting research shows that if our friends are having more sex, we're more likely to be having sex as well. Birds of a feather. Interestingly, homosexual males tend to have sex earlier than heterosexual males. Interesting fact. It appears as though we are becoming much more accepting of and much more open to many types of sexual behavior, which is a good thing because we're trying to get in touch with what's natural, which includes premarital sex and things of that nature. Even millennials, though, it's interesting. I found a couple of studies that show that even millennials, the young people who are so out of control, so to speak, are striving for fewer partners and more kind of monogamy, which is interesting. It's very similar to kind of the baby boomer generation. Another interesting fact for all of you out there who are my friends in the LGBT world, the number of people engaging in homosexual behavior is increasing, which means it's either becoming more acceptable or something genetic is going on, or more people are just coming out of the closet. It's hard to say what the truth is there, because again, all this stuff is very messy in terms of nature and nurture. Some more good statistics for everyone to be aware of. The vast majority of people begin having sex before the age of 20. And this is not a new concept. If you scroll the calendar back 200 years, it was the same case where people were having sex in adolescence and getting married, or even further back in history where people were getting married in their teens and having sex and having children. Interesting studies showed that so on the low end of things, only 51% of the population in like Portugal are having sex before the age of 20. Whereas in the high end, places like Iceland, 88% of the population has had sex before the age of 20. The proportion of adults who reported having heterosexual sex in the past year was highest among men, aged 25 to 39. Over 20% of adults have engaged in anal sex, interestingly enough. Whereas other research shows that it's something like 30% of women and 45% of men have ever had anal sex with an opposite sex partner. So 37% of heterosexual women, 45% of heterosexual men have ever had anal sex with the opposite sex partner. It's interesting why that's the case. We don't know. Over 44% of young adults engage in regular sexting. That's an interesting fact too. Men and women, and again, all these facts I'm throwing you away, all these statistics and numbers, obviously these are changeable depending upon time and culture, but for right now, this is what they basically are. And I'm building a case as to why we need to rethink our relationship with sex from an evolutionary side perspective, but I'll get to that in a second. What's interesting is men and women are built differently, just biologically and culturally and socially, as are varieties of homosexual subgroups and perceiving sexual availability and interests. And this is based upon kind of the evolutionary psychology of, if we, let's say, assess that someone is staring at us and interested in us, the heterosexual men tend to be more bent towards perceiving that someone is interested in them, whereas bisexual men tend to be slightly less aggressive in terms of perceiving that someone is interested in them if they're staring at them. And then heterosexual women, slightly less than bisexual men, and homosexual women right around the same as heterosexual women. It's just interesting. So there's some kind of inbuilt predisposition about perceiving kind of fertility and availability in the minds of people. These are all interesting facts that you should be aware of. You need to know what kind of creature you're coming across. So, why do we have sex? This is the big question in my mind because, again, things have changed dramatically. If you just take the old-fashioned line about sex and sexuality, sex is basically for connecting with people and procreation. There's a great evolutionary psychology author named David Buss, and he's got a great book out that I'll recommend for you guys. It's called The Evolution of Desire, Strategies of Human Mating. It's a great book. One of the quotes I like is, he says something along the lines of, humans, like other sexually reproducing species, do not choose mates randomly. We do not attract mates indiscriminately. Our mating is strategic, and our strategies are designed to solve particular problems in ways that lead to successful mating. So I'm on board with everything he said there, because he's kind of viewing sexual behavior as this kind of let's pass down the genes behavior. That's what evolutionary psychology does. It tries to theorize things from the perspective of what's going to get those genes to the next generation. I think, though, my argument is that we are using sex. We are using sex strategically, and we're using sex to solve particular problems. I think, though, it's being kind of distorted and bastardized for a variety of reasons. So when I scan through the literature on why we have sex from a variety of psychological, sociological, and evolutionary psych perspectives, these are some of the reasons that they listed in the literature. One of the reasons we have sex is just for enticement, just for the sake of practicing the skill of flirting. One of the reasons that we have sex is for maintaining a relationship once you've already bonded with someone. Another reason that people have sex and other animals have sex is to stave off jealousy. Another reason that people have sex is to rekindle a relationship. So there's maintaining a relationship, but then there's rekindling after things have died down. Another reason that creatures have sex is for fun. Another obvious reason is for child production. Another obvious reason is for aggression and dominance. I am going to be the alpha and fuck as many people as I can. Therefore, I am doing the best, and I have the best chance of passing down my genes and keeping other people from passing down their genes. Another reason that people have sex, and this is what I'm going to focus on, is to cope. And that's a very complex one. Another reason that people have sex somewhat more frequently is because they're trying to find good genes and find the best place to kind of deposit their material if you're a male. And another reason that people have sex is to maintain environmental stability. So the why and how that we have sex is also kind of affected by what kind of environment we live in. So if we have an environment where we don't have a lot of mates, then we're going to probably have fewer options for having sex, and we might struggle to be as sexually promiscuous or aggressive or whatever. But if we have an environment with lots and lots and lots of mates, so I live in Los Angeles, for instance, there are tons of attractive people everywhere. So the idea of finding someone to mate with is actually relatively easy out here because there's just so many everywhere. And the chances of me going out and mating with more attractive people are pretty good, given the environment. Not that I want to, but it's certainly what could be. And another thing that kind of affects our desire to have sex is just simply our genetic predisposition for either connection or kind of stamina and aggression. So if you look at the Big Five research, we're talking about things, oh no, that's not fair. It's kind of how aggressive is our personality, so to speak, how entitled is our personality, etc. And then there's all sorts of research I could talk about, you know, genetic variability in the vasopressin receptor and all sorts of different things. And and things of that nature, but it's really not worth describing here. The reality is there are a variety of good and bad reasons why humans and other primates have sex, and other species have sex. It's not just for the sake of passing down material. Now, you would hope, or evolutionary psychologists would hope, that all the other reasons we have sex that aren't purely for passing down genetic material would at some point kind of funnel into that or lead to that behavior. My take is we do both. We do kind of typical evolutionary psychology things like have sex for the sake of procreation and passing down material. I also think that because we are so smart and our cortex is so advanced and our society is so overloaded with brain stimulating, dopamine stimulating things, that it's easy to distort and kind of take one natural behavior and make it something more hedonistic and coping, as opposed to just connecting, maintaining, and passing down material in terms of sex. That's my theory. So I hope all that makes sense. So, sex and health, section number 2. So on the positive side of things, there are all sorts of cool things about having sex. I mean, sex is good for your health in general. Sex is good for if you're males, regular sexual activity, either alone or with someone, is good for your prostate health and prevents prostate cancer. I'm not a physician, but these are, what the studies show. Sex is generally good for heart health. Sex is generally good for your metabolism. Sex is generally good for a variety of basic physical health needs. Also good for your mood, if consistently practiced. What they found is for teens and young adults, one of the best things about being sexually active is that they get to kind of learn about themselves. And if their parents are, like for men or boys, teens, if the parents are more monitoring, not controlling, but just monitoring, asking them how it's going and if they're having any issues with sex or, are they using condoms and stuff like that, then they're more likely to decrease their risky sexual behavior. Whereas with teen girls, if the parents are slightly more warm and emotional in their connection and talking about sex and just curious, then they also engage in less promiscuous behavior and unsafe sexual behavior. It's interesting to find that men tend to be more sexually active than women across most cultures. Another sex and health positive thing is that, again, consistent sexual behavior in relationships and romantic relationships is highly correlated with both relationship satisfaction and the stability of relationships. So if you're dating someone and you're into them legitimately, or you're married or whatever, get to it. Make sure you have a regular kind of sexual life. It doesn't have to be rigidly planned out or something. Just make sure you're getting at least once a week or so, because, it actually helps relationships. It helps us stay close with each other. On the negative side of the health sex spectrum, we see that, for instance, people who were sexually assaulted in childhood or who experience high levels of shame in childhood about sex and sexuality were more likely to engage in risky sexual behavior. So kids who are molested, kids who are shamed for their sexuality, things of that nature, were more likely to do risky things like have unprotected sex, have sex while high on drugs and alcohol, and have multiple partners or engage in prostitution. That's just what the research shows. So we might not want to shame our kids or molest them, Catholic Church. Moreover, the more we involve drugs and alcohol in sex, the more risky it becomes, according to the research. Basically, the more alcohol and drugs you involve in sex, the more likely it is you either catch an STI or the more likely it is that you are going to be sexually assaulted. Right? So this is not obviously blaming the women for being drunk or blaming people for being drunk when they have sex. It's kind of a no-duh. If you're hammered, then it's really hard to read people's signals, and it's really hard to tell if someone's an aggressive douchebag or a creep. Whereas if you're perfectly sober, it might be slightly easier to tell how gross and disgusting and aggressive a person might be and how likely they might be to hurt you. Again, not victim blaming, just basic logic, right? It's interesting that according to the research, men tend to report not getting enough sex, whereas women tend to not get enough emotional connection prior to or after sex. Another interesting fact from the research is that being overly promiscuous, so there's having sex with multiple people, which might be okay and generally could be okay, but being overly promiscuous, being very not thoughtful, not mindful, having sex very indiscriminately, especially if you're intoxicated, is highly correlated to an inability to manage your emotional states, which I'll talk about more when I talk about the brain here. Another interesting fact is the internet pornography issue. So internet pornography is somewhat strongly correlated with having sex with multiple partners, engaging in prostitution, and having affairs. So those are just correlations. They're not causal. It's not saying if you watch porn, you will cheat or you will seek out prostitutes. It's just they were more likely, those males in particular, were more likely to engage in those behaviors. Another interesting fact from the research is where you meet your sexual partner increases your risk of STIs or STDs. So for instance, if you meet your sexual partner at a club or some kind of other alcohol serving venue, you're more likely to get an STD. Kind of checks out. If you're hammered, if you're intoxicated, your judgment goes down. You're more likely to walk away with someone who's willing to lie to you about having an STD, or just not tell you, or whatever. Same thing with going to things like bathhouses. It's a big deal in the gay community. There's a lot of sex clubs and bathhouses. And again, those are going to places like that. Makes it slightly more likely to get an STI. Though similar data exists for heterosexual individuals, there's a greater kind of prevalence of, consumption of bathhouses in the homosexual culture. And this leads me to the brain stuff, and I want to talk about two things. I want to talk about how sex generally affects the brain, and then I want to talk about one political issue of sex addiction. And I've been building sort of a quasi-case for that here. So the brain and sex, very important, I think. Basically, there are different brain systems for different basic biological and emotional functions. And things like the hypothalamus and the thalamus and the amygdala and the anterior cingulate and the insula and the fusiform gyrus and parietal cortex, occipital, all sorts of different parts of the brain responsible for basically either being aware of your body, aware of your safety, aware of your sense of pleasure, aware of your sense of power, are online when you're having sex. And it's important to note that those kind of same brain areas are conserved for other behaviors in life, right? So sex is a very brain-heavy, brain-intense activity in the sense that you can focus and read, and you'll have hyperactivity in certain brain areas, or you can focus and run a mile, and you'll have hyperactivity in certain brain areas, but not all of them. Whereas with sex, the brain is basically on fire in most important brain areas, most important cortical areas and subcortical areas. And when I talk about the chemicals here, it might make a little more sense why we might want to reconsider these attitudes towards sex as being just something we do for fun. So here's the deal. Sex works predominantly on our connection chemicals and our feeling powerful, feeling aggressive chemicals. So for males, when they're having sex, they have higher testosterone. Whereas for females, they have slightly higher testosterone, but even more, greater increases in estrogen. And across both sexes, when we're having sex, when we're seeking out sex, our seeking system, our dopamine, our quote-unquote reward system, but it's really a seeking system, goes off like crazy. And it's the extent to which our dopamine system goes off prior to sex or seeking out sex. How intensely it goes off is correlated to how often we have sex. Same thing with our opiate system. Everyone's talking about the opiate system for the opiate epidemic, but it's a very complex system that's deeply tied in with our dopamine system and deeply tied in with our emotions for feeling safe, for feeling connected, for decreasing fear and threat. So our opiate system goes off after we've copulated, after we've mated. So for males and females, typically more in males, orexins are going off in the hypothalamus. Oxytocin is going off for both sexes, but more strongly in females after sex. And for most species, there are kind of pheromone-specific patterns that get us aroused. So we'll never consciously smell a pheromone, but for instance, in the heterosexual world, you can kind of smell if a female is ovulating. There's a great Futurama episode where Zoidberg goes back to his home planet, and he talks about all these signs that he can tell that she's like flush with parasites and that she's ready and ovulating and ready to mate. It's hilarious because it's kind of the truth in the animal kingdoms. We can kind of smell when someone is receptive. And that's a big chemical cascade and symphony of dopamine and orexins in our opiate system and serotonin and norepinephrine and all sorts of things whenever we're engaged and active and aroused and interested. So because the sex kind of active seeking system is interwoven with our love and connection system in the brain, the opiate system, the oxytocin system, and things of that nature, it's really interesting when people talk about sex as either something for mating and maintaining a relationship, or it's just a fun thing we can do. Since our brain is not clearly differentiated for just having sex for fun, since it's so intermixed and interweaved with the love, connection, mating part of the brain and pair bonding part of the brain, the people who are very kind of pro, and I'm as liberal as it comes when about sex. I'm totally liberal and open about sex and sexuality and everything. There's just a caveat that since our brain is designed to have both a kind of mechanistic relationship with sex where we have sex for power and aggression and dominance and spreading the seed, but it's also, because we're a particular kind of mammal, it's highly interweaved with our connecting, feeling safe, feeling loved parts of the brain. It's really difficult to tease apart if you can just have sex for fun and sport. So we do have this animalistic side that wants to have sex for fun and sport. We do have this more evolved, more developed side that needs to have sex and be close with each other for the sake of maintaining relationships and fostering the next generation and all that good stuff. So for those of you who are interested in like pansexuality and open relationships and whatnot, I caution you to be very mindful about your partners and very mindful about what behavior you choose to engage in, so that you kind of let your brain do its job as it's naturally designed, where you allow yourself to have fulfilling relationships or one fulfilling monogamous relationship, and you don't discount that for the chance to have fun or go spread your seed or whatever. Males or females, doesn't honestly matter. Same principle. So I just want to put that out there. And that leads me to my last thought, and then I'll leave you all alone. There's a big debate in the world of psychology and in the world of addiction that I work in about whether or not there's really such a thing as sex addiction. And there's all sorts of Psychology Today posts about it, and there's a big debate in the research, kind of the literature, and there's lots of fMRI studies that are coming out in the last 6 or 7 years that are showing that there is some change in brains for people who kind of compulsively have sex to the point where it has negative consequences. So for instance, what we see is there's kind of a functional connectivity problem in the dorsal anterior cingulate, our stop-go system, down to our motivation system, down to our amygdala. So there's some kind of brain difference for people who have a problem with sex, whether it's legitimately a sex addiction or whatever you want to call it. You can call it problematic sexual behavior, just like people talk about problematic drinking is not addiction, whatever. The point of the matter is there are probably people all over the spectrum of sexuality where people who are not very interested in sex because of a variety of emotional, psychological, and biological reasons. And there are people who are way too interested in sex. And it could be because of both kind of attachment issues and psychological issues, and maybe you have that, orexin receptor or vasopressin receptor genetically passed down, so you're more likely to be compulsive sexually. Or maybe you've got crazy life experience or whatever. Maybe you are a sex addict, whatever that means. Just want to point it out to the world, for anyone who's interested, that the debate is kind of going on about sex addiction. And based upon what we know about the dopamine system and the opiate system for other addictions like drugs, alcohol, food, and whatnot, it's pretty reasonable to assume that someone's sexual behavior could go so far off the rails, not socially in terms of like, is it okay morally, but in terms of, is it causing consequences, and do we feel like we can't stop? That maybe it's an addiction. Maybe it is. Or maybe it's just so compulsive that there's something really wrong that we need to deal with it. So I'm not going to say more about that. Just want to put it out there that it's worth considering. It's worth thinking about, because certain people, it might be a huge problem. All right, this has been a very quick and dirty overview, very dirty overview of sex, sex in the brain, sex and health, and just kind of who has sex and when. I hope the reasons for having sex make sense to you guys. I want to, again, end on the note of, there are basically two categories of sexual behavior. There's sexual behavior for the sake of kind of the propagation of the species and passing down genes and maintaining relationships. And then there's sexual behavior for pleasure and dominance and aggression and all that stuff. But if you look at the brain, if you look at the human brain as well as animal brains that are similar to ours, the pathways for being sexually active and even sexually aggressive, as well for the path combined with the pathways for being connected and loving and feeling safe and secure with someone, are very, very interwoven. So to say that we're only designed for sex for fun, or we're only designed for sex for connecting, is kind of nonsensical at this point. We're kind of designed to step into new territories, but it's important to not forget that sex was originally a behavior designed for making sure the genes were passed down. Now, as humans evolve, maybe we can do more sex for fun and get away with it and it not destroy the species. Now, this is a big topic that Brett Weinstein, I think, talked a lot about in one of his talks, and it's worth listening to the man speak because he's brilliant and he knows all about much more than I ever will. We need to be careful about sex. It's become something that's turned into more of a sport thanks to these apps, thanks to cultural attitudes changing. And I have no problem with sex for fun. I think it's about the degree to which we engage in sex for fun. That's the debate. And what is it doing to our cultural kind of narrative, and what is it doing to our brains in terms of the next couple of generations that we engage in more sex for fun and walk away from some kind of relational commitment in terms of our brains specifically, not our morals, not our society, because that crap's all changeable regardless of that. The brain's more important because those genes that get passed down are the bigger problem in my mind, because you don't change genes rather easily. You can't switch them on and off rather easily across generations. So that's my soapbox about sex. I hope you have a great Sunday, and I will see you all very soon for my next talk in 2 weeks. Bye.